So we'll get started. So we're talking about interaction, and what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit more um, sort of control over the interactions that we started creating on um, Monday night. Let's see. Let me just check something. Okay. Okay. Um, so one of the things that, making digital art or programming based art or interactive art, computer art, affords us is that we can create interactive art. If you were making a painting or a film or a drawing, you can't really make it interactive. You can't make the content of the work change through user input. So interactivity is kind of more in the realm of the digital for the most part. There are kind of like interactive performances and stuff like that. But for the most part, interactive works are things like video games, um, interactive animations, installations, virtual reality, things like that. And the thing that these projects do, these works do that other things can't do is they react to events. So when we interact with something, the term we use in programming is an event. An event is anytime a user clicks on our web page or moves their mouse or uses their keyboard, or if you're in a VR, if you move um, your handles around. All of those things are described as events. And our computer programs can capture those events through sensors, and they use, sensors to say when an event is occurring and what type of event it is, and any other data that's related to that event. Um, we did this already, so I'm going to skip over this part. Um, Oh, actually, we started this, but we didn't do the other things. Okay, so I'm just going to write this up real quick. So remember last night, I did an example where, actually, let's move the background back here, where I took a line and I drew from mouse X, mouse Y to P mouse X, P mouse Y. And we can see that line drawing. And that's a good example of a continuous event. So some events are always changing over time, like the position of the mouse. That the mouse is always somewhere, so there's always a number related to the mouse. And so what the event is telling us is just at any given moment that we kind of sample or look for what that value is, it tells us that value. And so that's why we get this nice long consistent line. So that's the types of event that we looked at on Monday. But there's other types of events, and I think we looked at this briefly, but let's go to the reference again, and let's go to events. And so you can see some of our events related to the mouse are just variables. So these are the ones at the top that don't have any parentheses. And these ones down here that have parentheses, these are events that occur at one point in time rather than continuously over time. So things like if we drag the mouse, press the mouse, release the mouse, all of these refer to moments that start and end. And since these moments start and end, we usually capture them with functions. These are sometimes referred to as callback functions or handler functions. And P5 gives us a whole bunch of them, like mouse press, mouse release, mouse clicked. So we have a lot of control over exactly when these things happen. So if we wanted to update our drawing example, we could redraw the background when we click the mouse. So that's a pretty simple event that I could do. I could say function mouse pressed, and then just redraw the background. So just kind of cover up whatever I've drawn so far. And so now I still have this like continuous line that tracks the mouse, but if I click, I'm drawing a background. So I'm covering up everything that I drew before. So if I put a little transparency on here, we'll see more like what's really happening here. It's really just drawing a color over the background. But you can see that background changing event occurs at the moment that my mouse clicks, again, as opposed to the continuous changing of the mouse position. So those are the two different types of events that we can work with. So let's see. So another one is mouse dragged. And so mouse dragged is kind of a combination of our events. So when we have mouse drag, that means we've clicked the mouse, but then we're moving it. So this is an event that occurs when we're holding the mouse, but anytime we move it. So I can actually change, let's see what happens when I change my draw function to mouse dragged. So instead of drawing all the time, now I'm only going to draw this line uh, when when I click the mouse and drag. And I still have the other mouse press function on, so you can still see that's still working. Okay, so each time I draw the background, I'm covering up the previous drawing. I could turn that off if I want to control this more, so I could make a little drawing here, make a little drawing here. And now I have like, a lot more control. This is a really bad smiley face that I'm drawing, but I have a lot more control over the drawing that I'm making using the mouse dragged function. So that's just a couple examples. So we can use those as well as our moving uh, events to create interaction. So with mouse pressed and mouse dragged, we'll probably use those a little bit more in the future. But those are options if you want to make changes that happen at a particular moment rather than over time. Okay, so let's talk about the different types of things that we can interact with. So one of the main things that we can change is the position of a shape or a line or an image or any component of our drawing or composition. And this one is a little bit easier to understand because you can see in this example here, with position, it's easy to see how the change of the mouse position tracks directly to the change of our shape. So, using the self-portrait as an example, if I say mouse x equals x, or sorry, other way around, x equals mouse x, so it's very easy to see that my portrait is moving exactly in the same place as the mouse. And there's still some other interactions going on, but they're a little bit, uh, you know, um, uh, restricted by the change that I just made. But we can see that position changing, and there's this one-to-one relationship between the position of the mouse and the position of the self-portrait. So that's pretty easy to follow. But that's not the only way that we can do interactions. As you can see, I'm moving the mouse and changing other components of my self-portrait as well. Um, so let's look at some of the other ways that we can change the self-portrait. So we can actually change the color. And I think actually I did this a little bit on Monday as a quick example, but we can also change the color. So I have, let's see, I have the face color is this kind of like blue color, but let's use something else. So I'm going to move the face color down here. And instead of that, I'm going to say fill is mouse X, mouse Y, and let's do just 255 on the blue. So now you can see the color changing as I move the mouse. So this isn't exactly a one-to-one relationship because color doesn't exist in 2D space. Color is it goes across the color wheel. So it has a different dimensionality. But you can see I can map the movement of my mouse to the changing color in the self-portrait. Sorry, it's kind of distracting because I still have this other stuff in there. Let's uh, let's just comment that out for now. Okay, that's better. Okay, so notice that as I move the mouse over to the right, I add more red, and as I move the mouse down the page, I add more green. And the blue stays the same. So if I have all three, I get to this kind of white color, and if I go all the way back up here, then we get that blue color. Um, so again, I can sort of take the range of position, which is spatial, but use those numbers that are changing to change the color instead of the position. So that's another way that we can use our interactivity. Uh, and so when we're doing that, one thing that we're going to want to do is add a little bit of control. Because one thing that you'll notice, so let's move this guy over here. So notice that, let's turn off for just a second. I'm just going to set the green to 0. So it'll just change from blue to this sort of pink color as I move the mouse. And it might be hard to tell, but there's a point at which, as I move my self-portrait across the canvas, the color stops changing. You might be able to notice when it stops, but if we make the canvas a lot longer, then it'll be a lot easier to see. Okay, so blue, and then it changes to pink, but then it stays pink for a long time. So there's no color change in between here and here. And the reason for that is because the values for color have a specific range. And once we go past the end of that range, those numbers no longer work. So we're just taking the top of that range. So let me just, so remember our X starts at 0, and then the width of our canvas right now is 600. But our color range only goes from 0 to 255. That's the default for color. And so when X hits 255, which is, if half of our canvas is right here, it's going to be somewhere around there, a little bit before the halfway point. Once we hit that uh, point, then we're going over 255. And since P5 basically just says anything over 255, we just ignore, we get stuck at that 255 number. So what if we want to expand the whole range so that we have more room to work with and we can add more, more interaction to this? So that's where the map function comes in. So here's an example of the map function where you can see on the very left in this little demo, you can see the X value as it moves across the canvas. So it's just following my mouse. And when the X is all the way on the left, the color is 0 and the X position is 0. So the color is black. And as I move across the canvas, we move across the color wheel. And what map is doing is it's basically just doing a little bit of math. It's not really like the hardest math in the world, but it's not that easy either. But basically, it's saying it's using some math to say, whatever x is, we're going to say, the base range is 0 to 600. Okay, so that means that there are 600 units in the x position. And the current x value is 260. So we're basically going to say, what's 260 divided by 600? Okay, that, I don't know what that is. Let's call that n. Okay, so then we're going to say, well, our color range is 0 to 255. Okay, so what we have to figure out is what is n for 255. So this is pretty simple because this is still just 255. If we were starting at a different number like negative 100 or whatever, the math would be a little bit harder. But P5 can do that for us, so we don't have to worry about it. But just for this example, essentially all I have to do is take n times 255, and that's going to give me my color. Okay, because this proportion, this like little fraction here, is going to give me some percentage, right? As long as 260 is lower than 600, which it has to be because it has to be somewhere in that range. As long as 260 is lower than 600, it's going to give me some number between 0 and 1, right? It's not going to be above 1, and it's not going to be below 0. So it's going to be some percentage value. So let's say, it's probably something like 0.45. So then we just take whatever that is, multiply it by 255, and that gives us our color. So we can see that working in the example. When I get to about 300 on X, let's see right there, that's halfway. You can see the color value is pretty much halfway. So it's 127 is halfway between 0 and 255. And so that's what the map function can do for us. It basically does some basic math for us. It's a little bit tricky to write because we need 5 different values. We need the current value that we're mapping, then we need the first range, and then we need the second range. So using this slide as an example, to write the map function, I would just say map, and then I use the current value. So let's move x here. So the current value would be 198 in this case, or we can just say mouse x. And then we use the first range, so 0 to 600 is the first range. So that's this one. And then the second range, 0 to 255. And so once we do that, the result of this whole thing will be this number, which happens to be 84. So let's put that in to our program here. So instead of just saying mouse x is the red value, which is kind of like saying variable r equals mouse x, this is going to be the same thing for this red here. We're going to map this so that we get the whole range of color. And you can find map in the reference as well. I think it's under data maybe. No, that's like local storage stuff. Maybe it's under math. Yeah, there it is. Okay, map. So you can see an example of map here, and this one's interactive. That's kind of cool. And then you can see the description down here. So let's make this a little bit more sophisticated. I'm going to comment this out and say variable r. So I start with map. And then, as I mentioned, it's a little tricky because there's 5 different values, but as long as we know what they are, it's not too bad. So we're going to start with mouse x, and it doesn't have to be mouse x. It could be mouse y. It could be something else, but we're going to start with mouse x. And our first range is the range of the value that's changing. So that's the 0 to the width of our canvas. I could type in 600 here because I know the width is 600, but if I change it at any point, this width, that'll mess it up. So I'm going to use the value width here. And then 0 to 255 is our color value. And that's always going to be the case. Our colors are always 0 to 255. So now, oh, and then, yeah, I think it should work. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so now here's 255. It's still changing, and it keeps changing all the way up to 600. So that's pretty cool. That's like mapping it very directly, but we don't have to do that exactly. So, but we can see we get this much better range of values than we had before. And just as an example, I can also use mouse Y here, but then of course I would want to use the height instead of the width, even though in this case they're the same number. So we see that same range. So a couple other things I can do here, I can reverse this. So instead of going from 0 to 255, I can flip and go from 255 to 0. So now it starts pink and it goes to blue. And of course I could reverse the other one as well, but then I would be back to where I was. But then I can also, I don't have to start at 0. I could say, what if I always want at least a little bit of red? And I don't have to go all the way to 255. I could just go to 200. So now I have a little bit of red and I have a little bit more red, but I'm not going all the way to the end or all the way to the beginning. That's another option that I have. Another thing, we can't see this because once my mouse goes off the edge, so does our self-portrait. But by default, the map will actually let you kind of like go outside of the boundaries a little bit. So let's say I had a very narrow range for my color. Let's say it was like 0 to 100. And let's map mouse Y instead for just a second. So now when I start at 0, it gets a little bit pink. I don't have enough room on my monitor to show this. Maybe actually, I'll just use frame count. That'll be easier. So let's use frame count. And I'll go to, let's just go to 1,000. Okay. Can't tell if it's working. Maybe it's too slow. Let's speed it up. Let's do 100. Okay, you can see it's getting red. But notice it's supposed to stop at 100, but it's getting pretty pink. So it doesn't actually stop at 100. It goes past the range that we asked it to. That, for whatever reason, is the default setting for map. If I want it to really like hard cut off at this 100 value, I can add a parameter at the end, which is just true. This parameter is referred to as within bounds, and the default is false. But if we set it to true, then it keeps the value within the bounds that we set. Okay, so now we can run this again, and you can see it never goes past that 100 value. Um, so we can kind of restrict it there, and we can also restrict it here. So I could say 100 to 200, and you'll see it'll never go to 0. It'll start at 100 and go up to 200. If I reverse those, like if I go to 200 to 100, it's never going to go below 100. So it stays a little bit pink. It's probably, I don't know how easy it is to see this. It's kind of subtle with these colors, but anyway, hopefully that makes sense. So you don't have to do that, but generally I throw the true there at the end just so I don't get some weird result that I wasn't intending for. And I actually kind of like the way this looks because it kind of let's put that back. I'm gonna go from 0 to 255. It kind of makes it look like my self-portrait is blushing, which is kind of fun. Like the face is getting red. I guess I could put some like cheeks on there, but I'll stick with this for now. Okay, so let's continue. So of course the other thing that we can interact with is size. And so size is a little bit similar to position, except it's not like directly mapped onto each other. So you can change the position of the mouse and see the size grow in relationship to that position. But it's not as directly mapped as um, our uh, our position value. So I actually already had something that was using size, which is the size of my eyes. So let's move this over for a second. I'm gonna turn off this mouse X thing here. Okay, and let's put our canvas back to the way it was. There we go. Okay. So what I'm gonna do now is bring back the eye interaction that I had. And so in this example, the eyes kind of like get bigger the farther away they go, but they get really way bigger than I want them to. And so this is a good chance to kind of restrict them a little bit more. And so I was already using a little bit of math here, essentially to make it sure that the eyes are only going in one direction. So I can still use this as my map value, but now I can just throw this into a new variable. So I'll leave that one there. I'll just comment it out and create a new one. And so I'm going to start with map. And before I throw in that other version, let's just do mouse Y. So I'm going to use mouse Y. And so instead of going like as big and as small as possible, I can restrict it. So I can set the default. I can also get this thing where I had to add 10 to the beginning so it wouldn't be 0. I can add that in there as well. So now for my mouse Y, I'll start at 0, which is the top of the canvas, and go to height. Um, and then, or actually, no, I don't want to use, um, I'll use that first, but then we'll fix it in a second. So I'm going to start at the top and go to the bottom. And I'm going to restrict this. So now the smallest my eyes can be is 10, and the biggest they can be is, let's say, 40. So it'll be a little bit more of a subtle uh, thing. So that's kind of fun. Basically, my character, as time goes by, the character's face is turning red. And if I pull down on the mouse, we see that the eyes are getting bigger. Um, but they're kind of staying in the head. And that's kind of the point. I have a lot more control over the look of the interaction. So now I want to make it so that they get bigger in both directions. And that's where I can use this Y minus mouse Y. So I'll copy that in here. And so now if I go down or up, it's going to be the same. But now you can see they're not moving as much. And that's because partly because um, I have this really high range, and the height of the canvas is the whole canvas, and I can't actually get my mouse that far away from the eyes. So let's change that to something a little bit smaller, like 100. And so notice now they're going higher than I want them to. So let's restrict the range. I'm going to put true at the end there. Okay, so now they're going like way too fast. So let's move this value up to 200. There we go. So now if I go up, they go up. But if I go down, they don't go down. And that's what that absolute value is doing. Because y minus mouse y, if I go above this value, let me just draw this real quick. So y is right here where the eyes are. So if my mouse is up here, this number, whatever it is, let's say it's 100, minus this number, let's say this is 50, is going to be 50. And so it's going to map 50 onto this range, which is going to give me, whatever number. But if I go below here, now the mouse is down here. So now I'm saying 100 minus, let's say this value is 150. 100 minus 150 is negative 50. And negative 50 is below my range over here. So that's why I'm not getting anything when I go below uh, the eyes. And so that is why I want to use this absolute value. And so I just have to wrap this whole thing in the absolute value. So that gives me a positive number in both directions. Okay, so that's pretty good. Let's put our nose back in here. And so now we've got our little Pinocchio thing and the eyes moving the way I want to. So that gives me a lot more control over the basic setup for my interaction. You don't have to use all of those factors, but depending on what your goal is with the interaction, if you're just like we saw the one last night where we were just moving the ice cream into the screen, you don't really need anything too fancy for that. That just mapping X to the ice cream cone is pretty easy. But if you're doing something where you have the different colors doing different things or something more complex, you can use some of these other approaches. Okay, let's continue. I'm not going to show these examples. So yeah, this part here is just kind of what I was talking about. We want to have meaningful interaction. So, it's easy to make a color change or, make your ears get bigger or something like that. But we want to give it some kind of reason behind it. We want to give it some kind of story behind it. So, it kind of just came out of trying random stuff, but with my project, I kind of have this nice story coming out of it, which is that, this character is getting kind of embarrassed because his nose is growing, which if you're familiar with the Pinocchio story, that would suggest that he's telling a fib, and his eyes are kind of moving as the nose grows bigger. So it's not like it's kind of like just a random thing, but it does give us something to create kind of like a narrative around what's happening on the screen. Okay, so I'm going to go over submitting the assignment. There's one more component to the assignment that we want to add before we do some documentation and submit it, which is some instruction. So as I mentioned before, with interactive work, people don't necessarily know it's interactive unless we prompt them in some way. And the easiest way to do that is just tell them to move their mouse or to do something. There's other ways to do it, like you could have like a little icon. You could have some instructions or something like that, or like an animation of the mouse moving or something. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add some text in here. We haven't learned P5 text yet. It's not really that complicated. We are going to learn it next week. But since we haven't learned it yet, I'm just going to put it into the HTML that this web page is using. So I don't know if we've actually looked at this before, but if I click on the little arrow over here, it shows me all the files in the website. We are actually writing a website, even though we're mostly writing JavaScript over here. So what I can do is go to my index.html page. And in this section, this main section, that's where the script adds the canvas. So I can just put something either above or below that with some instructions. So, whichever you prefer. I'm gonna use a P tag here. If you don't remember your HTML, the P tag essentially is just a paragraph. So it's good for some default text. And I'm just going to put some basic instructions. I'm going to say move the mouse to um, change Pinocchio's nose. Okay, so the text is hard to see because of the background that I have on here. So we can also add a little bit of CSS to this page just to fix that. So I'm going to go over to the style.css and I'm just going to set a background color for the HTML body. So let's just say it's pink. So then we can see the text. So you don't have to, it doesn't have to be like super perfect styling or anything like that, but we just need to make it visible. And I wrote mouse the mouse, which is not what I meant to write. I meant to write move the mouse. Uh, and I guess change is not, let's say grow Pinocchio's nose. Okay. Move the mouse to grow Pinocchio's nose. So just some basic instruction to prompt your user to say like, you can actually interact with this. Um, it's not really related to the code itself, but it's a good thing to keep in mind when you're creating interactive art or any type of interactive work. If you're making a video game, you have to tell people what buttons to hit. It's just something that we have to consider as interactive developers. Okay, so I'm basically done now with my setup, but I want to do a little bit of documentation. And I mentioned earlier that it's going to be tricky for me to do this because I'm already recording. So what I'm going to do instead is just save a few different images and then post them on WordPress as a gallery. So you can actually make a video, and I'll show you guys, as I mentioned, a link where it shows you to do that. But in the absence of a video, we can just take multiple stills of our project, and that will kind of give the user a sense of what the project looks like. So in order to do that, I'm actually going to use one of my event functions. I'm going to say function mouse pressed, and I'm just going to save an image. So I'll save uh, sketch.png. And so each time I click, it'll save an image in my um, downloads folder. And then I can just put all of those in my OpenLab post. Okay, so I'm going to do that now. I'm going to try to get a couple good uh, images here. So I'm just kind of clicking a bunch and then I can upload those and see how it looks. So with interactive work, when we document it, we need to show the process of interaction. We can't just like have one image because then it's not clear what it's going to do. Okay, so now I've got some documentation. I've got my project here. I'm ready to submit my assignment. And so this is a bit of review, but since we're doing something a little bit different, I'm going to do that. So I'm going to go to the Open Lab and oh, I need to log in. I always just assume that I'm already logged in here, but I'm not. It's being kind of slow. Um, Hopefully it works. Sometimes the Open Lab is a little bit slow. Okay, it's chugging along. Okay, it logged me in. All right, so I'm gonna go to my courses and find, here we go, MMP 210, and go to the course site. Okay, so now I'm ready to make my post. I'm gonna click on the plus button here. And so I'm gonna choose a category first off. I don't see it on here, so I'm just gonna type in interactive, and there we go, interactive self-portrait. I'm going to type in here, interactive self-portrait. And so now I'm going to add a few images. And one way to do this, you don't have to do it this way, but one way to do this in OpenLab is with a gallery. So instead of adding an image, I can add a gallery here and then click upload and then go to my downloads folder. And I actually took a whole bunch of images. I'm just going to take all of them. I can always remove them if I want to. So here's my gallery. It looks pretty good. I want this one to kind of be at the top. So I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of this last one. So I'll click on here on the menu and go to remove. And then I'll click on this button to swap this one all the way up here. Okay, so then I'll just write a little documentation. So here's my interactive self-portrait. based on Pinocchio. Uh, you can here's the code. And so then I just need to put a link to the code here, and I can select the code and hit Command K to turn this into a link. And I want to make sure to open in a new tab. And that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and preview this. So that looks pretty good. And if I click on the code, just double check that that works. And so there we go. That's basically how I would do that. As I mentioned, if you want to do a video that will kind of show more of the interaction, there is a page on here called documentation resources. And essentially there's just some YouTube tutorials, which would be, you could find these easily on your own, but these are a few that I've seen before and I know that they are decent. And so there's how to take a screenshot. There's how to do a screen recording on Windows and Mac. And then if you want to be really fancy, you can use OBS and add overlays and stuff like that, but it's probably not necessary. But those are a few things that you can try. All right, so we're at a good time to stop the demo here and move to in-class workshop time. So this assignment is due on Monday. You just have to add one component of interactivity. So, you might have like pretty ambitious ideas, and that's cool if you do, but I wouldn't go too crazy. Just find something that is kind of funny or interesting or whatever, and add some interactivity to it. If you don't really have any ideas, again, I would go check out the student work page on the homepage here. You can find a bunch of old self-portraits and other types of things that might give you some inspiration. And if you want to, share what you're working on to get some feedback during class, we can do that as well. So I'm going to stop the recording here.